Hi, I'm back, and today I'm going to discuss Hamlet Act II. This is a two-scene act, but it has some very important details and events which are going to be important for your analysis. Act 2, Scene 1 begins with Polonius and Ronaldo. They talk about Laertes. Ronaldo is not going to be relevant again. He's just a character that's being used to show how controlling Polonius is of his children. He gets sent to France to watch over Laertes and poke around and see how he's doing to represent the family. And then there's basically not a ton else that happens in Act 2, Scene 1. Hamlet comes around and Ophelia... Hamlet comes and sees Ophelia, and Ophelia panics because he looks crazy, which is a continuation of Act 1, where Hamlet told Horatio that if he was not acting like himself, he was still in control of his faculties. So Ophelia says, Lord Hamlet, with his doublet all embraced, no hat upon his head, his stockings fouled, unguarded, and down-gyved to his ankle. So basically, Hamlet is super undressed and looks weird, and she says a look so piteous in purport as if he had been loosed out of hell to speak of horrors. This leads Polonius to believe that Hamlet is acting crazy because he loves Ophelia. They talk a bit back and forth. Then Polonius comes to talk to the king and the queen. King and the queen talk to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who will be very important later. King and the queen basically say, welcome, you're supposed to spy on Hamlet and talk to us about what he says and how he's doing because he trusted you guys. They're supposed to be his childhood friends, even though they don't get referenced earlier. And then following that, Polonius comes in and they talk about Norway and Fortinbras, who is a character that will become important later. He's a warlord, essentially, that's been kind of chasing close to Denmark. But he was told not to continue his path by his uncle, who they simply call Norway, because he's the king of Norway. And so after a bit of courtly nonsense, where they just kind of talk back and forth about that, Polonius calls Hamlet mad, which is important, obviously, because one of the thematic ideas that we talked about in Act 1 is whether or not Hamlet is really going to end up going crazy, and whether or not we can believe what we read or what we would be actually seeing. Polonius kind of talks over himself. The queen tells him more matter with less art, which is funny because a lot of this play uses extra flowery language even for the time to get across certain ideas. Polonius continues and reads one of Hamlet's love letters to Ophelia, to the king and queen. Essentially, he convinces them that he might still be in love with Ophelia, even after Polonius told Ophelia to ignore him. Polonius updates the king and the queen with what they're doing. Then Polonius goes to talk to Hamlet, and this is where it gets interesting because Hamlet starts to do his little act. In the asides, you notice that he is basically putting it on in this scene, but he begins to be rather sarcastic. You can read for the double entendres and meanings yourself, but it just adds to the idea that you can't really trust what's going on here. What else? Basically, this scene is important because it's the first time Hamlet is really rebelling hard against one of the royals, and Polonius is coming to talk to him, and he's just completely ignoring him. Not ignoring him in that he's not talking to him, but he's dancing around him. He calls him a fishmonger, which you can look up. He calls him old, and he just continues to make jokes the whole time. Then Guildenstern and Rosencrantz come in, and they kind of dance around each other, make jokes. There are more double entendres, more sexual entendres. They just keep joking back and forth around each other. And a lot of the things that Hamlet says, like I said, are really inappropriate, which is important not because it's funny or silly or we should laugh at it, but it's important because he's the Prince of Denmark, and for him to be saying these things is a very good signal to the characters, not to us, that he's mad. And so the more and more he loosens his tongue, the more and more everyone around him thinks he's crazy, except for Horatio and us, depending on our interpretation. So after some conversation, Hamlet basically says that he knows what's going on and that the king and queen have sent for them to be there. More jokes, more jokes. They talk for quite a while Guildenstern and Rosencrantz try and squeeze out any information that they can get out of Hamlet, because that's what they've been ordered to do by the king. Polonius enters, and then they talk about the actors, the players, which have arrived to play essentially for the court, and Hamlet immediately asks them to put on a speech, which is interesting because it's a speech about love and violence, and Hamlet seems very impassioned by it and mocks Polonius for not enjoying it. Then Hamlet essentially asks the players to play a play called The Murder of Gonzago, which is important because later on in the act he's going to say that he is setting them up to play a play exactly like the ghost told him that he was murdered. So that kind of sets up, it's not really a theme, but there's a lot of like what's going on under the surface in terms of the politics of the scenario. There's a lot of that happening every scene. So, or every scene that has to do with royal deliberation. And then Hamlet has his "A rogue, oh what a rogue and peasant slave I am I" monologue. He basically gets on himself for not being willing to attack Claudius. Am I a coward who calls me villain, breaks my paid across, plucks my beard and blows it in my face, tweaks me by the nose? For it cannot be, but I am pigeon-livered and lack gall to make oppression bitter. So essentially, Hamlet is beating himself up for not having the will to attack Claudius yet, and then he resolves himself to work through the work through the play. Sorry, I was reading a line. He works through the play, and he's going to set it up so that everyone gets disturbed by, or specifically Claudius gets disturbed by the similarities with his murder. The themes for this act aren't really that strong. They're kind of just continuation of the ideas from Act 1, but I would say focus on the deception. There's a lot of underneath the current events, and seeing isn't believing, and what you hear isn't always what you should pay attention to, and the whole idea that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are there to deceive Hamlet and be his friend and pretend, when really they're there to betray him. It just adds to that more. There are a lot of asides where the characters are kind of talking to themselves in the audience, and you get to hear everyone's real thoughts. You should pay attention to all of the asides, I think, especially in this act. And every time Hamlet monologues, you should analyze it pretty heavily, because Hamlet's monologues are like the important quotes from every act. There are more, but his are usually the most important. That's all I have, but if you have any questions, you should ask Miss Stenson, and I believe that is all I have for you. There are themes you can get out of this act, but none that I think are really important or overarching for the whole play, except for Hamlet's monologue, which I think is decently obvious and I already talked about. So that's everything, and I hope you have a good day and enjoy Act 2.